This is Southampton Story, a community effort to build a stronger Southampton.
We had a problem with nesting plovers that unfortunately were predated sometime early this morning by apparently what looks to be seagulls. People came down and dug this trench, and as you can see, we've got some water flowing, obviously nowhere near the amount that we need, but we do have some water that we've been able to get flowing to the ocean. This is routinely cut open by the trustees. We do have a permit to do this, but we don't have authority to disrespect the Threatened and Endangered Species Program and the birds. So in collaboration with those requirements, this is what we were able to do. Hopefully now, maybe next week, we'll be able to get in here with a machine and make a proper cut so that we can refresh this bay with salinity and let spawning fish go back and forth and alleviate the high bay conditions and restore the ecosystem back to the way it needs to be.
Hi, my name is Ann Welker, Southampton Town Trustee. It's pretty windy down here today at Mecox Bay at the Cut. There were probably between 30 and 50 of us here digging today over the course of the morning. And why were we digging? To open the cut at Mecox Bay. Typically, we do it with large heavy equipment, an excavator and a payloader, but we're unable to do that due to the presence of piping plovers, nesting piping plovers, which are an endangered species. So the permit that we usually apply for with mechanized opening, we were not able to get. We were, however, able to get permission to hand dig. Hand digging has been done for hundreds of years, maybe not in the past 100 years, but it's been done for hundreds of years by the Native Americans. The Native Americans started to dig these coastal ponds, Georgica, Sag, and Mecox, because it improved water quality, which wasn't as much of an issue then. Then it was more to keep the ponds brackish. These ponds are a mix of salt and fresh, which is called brackish. The ideal salinity is sort of between 12 and 17. There's a really healthy crop of wild oysters in Mecox Bay, and that salinity is critical for their health.
This started at about 9:30, right?
We started shoveling at 9:30. The monitors came out they had to be out by DEC regulations 2 hours beforehand, so they were out at 7:30 in the morning to check on the birds, and then we started shoveling at 9:30.
Gotcha. So if this was to remain closed, what would that mean?
Well, it means that these cesspools are in the water. There are people that cannot flush their toilets. There are sump pumps that are running non-stop to keep people's basements from flooding. There's substantial agricultural hardships because the roots of all these crops are in the water table, and you can't kind of work your farm under those conditions. And you have salinity that is decreasing and placing all the shellfish under substantial stress, and that's what occurs. That's why we have to follow our parameters, our trigger points to open and sometimes mechanically close this bay. But again, you have federal laws and concerns for threatened and endangered species, and we look to collaborate with folks. Unfortunately, prior to us getting here, there was predation of that nest that people were concerned about. It's nature. This is what happens sometimes. You can see the winds blowing here. It's a bit of a harsh dynamic environment.
We also dig the pond when it gets to a certain height. So salinity, water quality, and bay height. The bay height has really been the trigger that we've been really challenged by the last couple years, and especially the past month or so. We had, as we typically do, heavy spring rains, and with climate change we're having increasingly more frequent heavier rains, and that contributed to the rise in the bay. The other thing that's been a problem is that because we haven't had what would be termed successful openings over the course of the past, really it's almost several years now, the water table is very high. So when the water table is high and the bay is high, it can back up into basements and sometimes into septic systems. And that is what can happen around Mecox Bay. So that's why it's really critical. It's really a public health situation when we get to that kind of a parameter when we're looking at high Enterococcus levels, which the Surf Riders Blue Water Task Force tests for on a weekly basis during the season. And we saw some not high levels, but concerningly medium high levels. And that really created the impetus for us to request hand digging. At this point is not really too successful, but you can always hope, and we only had permission to dig for one day. So the reason we didn't have a successful opening is because, as you can see, there's pretty big ocean today. There's pretty big surf. So that surf is pushing against any water that might be trying to come out of the bay. And we timed it. We dug a little bit early. Usually when we dig with the machines, we wait until just after high tide to open, because then the tide is dropping. We open and the bay gets pulled with the ocean. The bay water gets pulled with the ocean water. The other thing that's a little tricky here is the difference between the height of Mecox Bay and the height of the ocean. There's a greater difference in the elevation at Sag Pond. So it's actually easier. If we had to do this at Sag, we would have been more successful. Here, the bay and the ocean are about the same height, so there's not that drop in elevation. So if we had that, and we dug down 4 feet today, and we dug deeper as we got closer to the ocean.
Is there any reason why they don't build a permanent structure?
So that has been brought up, especially as we have more trouble in the summer getting it open, because we can open it. We have a permit now that's for 5 years to open as needed between September 1st and April 1st. But between April 1st and September 1st, during the spring and summer months, it's endangered species season. So we're working against the presence of piping plovers and presence of least terns, both of which are either threatened or endangered. And our ability to dig during that time is very limited.
Viaduct, maybe in an emergency situation like this, properly pitched, could alleviate, let down an emergency, perhaps get the cesspools out of the water, but we still would need to have the ability to refresh salinity, and you'd still want to allow spawning fish to be able to enter the system. So you got a lot of dynamics that you have to account for.
Then the other question was, very much like a cesspool, can't you have an underground pipe?
Yeah, well, that's what we were talking about, but the engineering and the timing on that is huge. Permitting and the cost factors when you get involved. They were talking about doing a pipe pump type system in western Shinnecock to alleviate poor water quality there. And the numbers were astronomical, and the permitting required was very, very onerous. So, things like this grand plan could perhaps, be something that could work. But I really think a lot quicker and simpler solution is greater flexibility on the management and the guidelines and how we deal with these birds, because I firmly believe with the distance that we had to these birds, if we would have modified how we do things, came in from the east utilizing smaller equipment, we perhaps could have alleviated this a lot easier. It's a matter of guidelines, and you also have to balance out the rest of the nature that's being put in harm's way and under pressure. So I think if you figured out how to get people to the moon and back, I think we could have figured out how to protect the birds and come in here with a small machine.
That's kind of where my brain is going.
Well, that's common sense.
And it's if we could do that, why can't we do this?
I fully respect everybody's concerns, and I care very much about protecting wildlife.
I applaud the many people that made this happen, the cooperation between the DEC, the Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the many people within the town, Parks Department, the town engineer, the Highway Department, the Public Safety Department, and of course the trustees. And then many people from the public as well came out and volunteered to dig this morning. So there you go. It's a hand-dug try. It's just one of those things where the brightest minds and the best backs and legs just weren't. It wasn't meant to be. Mother Nature is always in charge.
Thanks for joining us. See you next time on Southampton Story.